She stood with a sack on her head, sold like cattle. He paid $2 and took her home. Then she spoke, and the voice stirred a memory he buried deep in a snowstorm long ago. That moment sparked a story of scars, silence, and a love no one saw coming. Oregon Territory, spring of 1869. The sun had barely cut through the gray when the crowd gathered in the center of Cold Creek, a dust-choked outpost carved into the edge of pine and stone. Men stood elbow to elbow, boots scuffing the dry boards of what passed for an auction stage. Nothing more than wagon planks nailed together, already creaking under the weight of the day. The air smelled like old tobacco, mule sweat, and the bitter ash of last night's fire. Laughter was thick, sharp like tin on teeth, and it bent mean around the corners of men who hadn't bathed in weeks. Whiskey passed in cracked flasks. Nobody smiled with kindness. Kindness didn't sell well out here. She stood at the center, barefoot, hands bound in front with fraying twine. A sack covered her face, cinched tight around the neck. It hung too low, covering her shoulders like a shroud. She didn't move, not when the deputy called for silence, not when he slammed his fist on the post and shouted, "Last one for the day." "This here," he barked, jabbing a thumb toward her, "ain't got no name, no papers. Says she can cook, sew, keep house. Traveled quiet all the way from Missouri, sack on since the start. Claimed she'd rather not be looked at." Some fool hollered from the back, "Maybe she's a corpse," another added, "or a witch." The crowd roared. The woman's fingers twitched, just barely, a breath caught in the sack's cloth, shallow and fast. "Starting at $2, the deputy barked. "Who's brave or drunk enough to marry what's under there?" No one moved. A long minute passed. Then boots struck dirt, not fast, not loud, steady. From the edge of the crowd, a figure stepped forward, tall, broad, face shadowed beneath the brim of a weather-worn hat. A canvas coat hung heavy off his shoulders, dust-streaked and threadbare at the sleeves. His hands were thick, calloused. One held a folded note, the other gripped the handle of a saddle-worn pack. He walked like a man who'd spent more years among cattle and timber than folks. $2, he said. The deputy squinted. "You sure?" The man didn't blink. "I said what I said." "Name?" "Ethan Cole, North Ridge, rancher." A few men chuckled. "Desperate bastard," someone muttered. The deputy shrugged. "Fine then. Let it be known that Mr. Cole hears, agreed to lawful union under witness of this court and the eye of God himself." He scratched something onto a paper, handed it to the stranger, who signed it without looking. Then the deputy turned to the woman. "Say your name, miss, for the record." Silence. The crowd leaned in. Then soft, so soft you had to stop breathing to hear it. "Clara Mayfield." Ethan froze, not a flinch, not a twitch, but something in his jaw tightened. His eyes, hard and pale as creek ice, fixed on the sack. He knew that voice. The crowd stirred but said nothing. Not this time. Ethan stepped forward, took the woman's arm, gently, like she might crumble in his hands. He didn't speak, just led her down the steps, through the crowd that parted with unease. No one stopped them. And as the sun dipped behind the ridge, casting long shadows over Cold Creek, the name still rang between them, Clara Mayfield, like a ghost come walking out of the pines. The trail that led north out of Cold Creek wasn't much more than a pair of worn ruts climbing into the pine. The wind shifted there, cooler, quieter, no more drunk laughter, no more auction bark, just the creak of saddle leather and the crunch of boots on dry earth. Ethan Cole walked ahead, reins in one hand, the other resting near the old colt strapped to his hip. The mule behind him carried a single rolled blanket, a sack of beans, and a cast-iron pot. The woman walked behind the mule, barefoot, silent, the sack still drawn tight over her head. Her dress was plain, dust-covered, hem fraying. She didn't stumble, but her steps were slow, unsure, like a deer too used to being hunted. Ethan didn't speak. He wasn't much for talking. The trail spoke enough if you knew how to listen. They climbed higher, past the split cedar and the rusted fence line that marked the start of his land. The wind carried the scent of wood smoke, distant, familiar. He glanced once over his shoulder, just enough to see she was still there, still walking. At the top of the hill sat the cabin, plain, strong, built by his hands and no one else's. Smoke curled from the chimney. The roof sagged on one side, and the door leaned slightly, but it was dry and warm. The place looked lonely, because it was. He reached the door first, opened it wide, then stepped aside. "You pick where you stand," he said, voice quiet. "No one's going to place you anymore." Clara stepped inside, not fast, not slow, just cautious, like every board might break beneath her. She didn't sit, she didn't speak. She made for the far corner, crouched low, back to the wall, hands on her knees like she meant to disappear. Ethan let her be. He dropped his gear near the stove, set a small fire going, fetched water from the barrel outside. The kettle sang before long. Then came the scent, beans and wild onions, smoked venison he'd kept from winter. He cooked like he worked, steady, measured, no waste. He set 2 bowls on the table, one in front of the other chair. The other he placed near the wall, about 3 feet from where Clara sat. Not too close, not too far. She didn't move. Ethan sat, ate slow, not looking at her, not ignoring her, just being there, the way you sit with a skittish horse, not saying a word until it chooses to come near. Minutes passed. Then her voice, barely above the fire crackle. "What is this?" He looked up from his spoon. "I call it supper. Same thing I ate last night. Same thing I'll eat tomorrow." She didn't laugh, but something in her shoulders eased. He added, "Used to make 1 bowl. Then I started making 2. Even when no one was here to eat the second." Clara turned her head slightly, just a tilt, enough to see the bowl beside her, steam rising, no one else in the room. Ethan didn't say more, didn't ask for thanks, didn't ask for anything at all. She reached for the bowl, hands shaking. She didn't take the sack off, but she ate. Small bites. Quiet. Careful. And for the first time since Cold Creek, there wasn't just silence between them. There was the sound of 2 people breathing in the same room. That night, sleep came slow. Ethan sat near the hearth, elbows on his knees, the firelight painting long gold shadows across the log walls. Outside, the wind crept through the pines like it was looking for something it had lost. He didn't speak, didn't move much. Just stared into the flames, eyes distant, jaw tight. Behind him, in the far corner of the cabin, Clara lay curled on a bedroll. She still hadn't removed the sack. Even in sleep, her body curled like a question mark, tense and quiet. The fire popped, and Ethan went back. Not in his body, but in his bones. Back to that winter 3 years gone. He'd been cutting timber too far north up near Black Ridge, greedy for wood and half blind with pride. Thought he could outwork the snow, thought he could beat the cold. But the mountain didn't care for pride. A patch of ice, a bad step. 1 leg twisted wrong beneath him. By the time he stopped sliding, he'd cracked a rib, maybe 2, and the snow had started falling for real. He'd tried to crawl, didn't make it far. His last memory before blacking out was the sound of wind howling like a dying coyote, then warmth and hands. Rough, sure hands dragging him into a narrow place, a crack in the rock, the smell of smoke, bark, and wet wool. A fire already going, the dim orange light flickering against a sack-covered face. She didn't say much, just, "Drink this." The brew tasted like boiled roots and bitter moss. He gagged on the first sip. She didn't flinch, just tipped the cup again and said, "You don't drink, you don't wake up again." She set his leg. burned clean cloth to cauterize the wound, fed the fire every time it sputtered, sat close enough to watch him, but not enough for him to reach. The whole time, the sack stayed on, tied tight, like she feared being seen would break something that couldn't be fixed. When he woke again, she was gone, left behind a square of cloth, folded neat beside the fire, hand-stitched wildflowers in purple thread. Uneven but careful, a message with no words. He kept it, tucked it in the inside pocket of his coat. Never told a soul, and now that voice, soft, measured, a little hoarse with fear, but the same voice. Clara Mayfield. He looked over his shoulder. She hadn't moved, just a small rise and fall beneath the sackcloth. Ethan turned back to the fire, pulled the handkerchief from his coat, rubbed his thumb over the old stitching. Not fresh. Faded from years of sweat and dirt and memory. He didn't need proof. He'd already felt it when she said her name. The next morning broke slow, wrapped in mist and the kind of stillness that usually came before a storm, or a choice. The sky hung low over the ridge, and the cabin sat quiet beneath the leaning pines like it was holding its breath. Ethan stepped out early, fed the mule, checked the traps he'd set near the creek. When he came back, the cabin door was slightly ajar, not wide, not swinging, just ajar. He pushed it open gently. Clara wasn't in the corner. He looked toward the back wall. No one. His hand dropped instinctively to his hip, grazing the butt of his Colt. Then, out the window, a flicker of movement. Near the tree line. She was standing at the edge of the clearing alone, facing the woods, still in that same worn dress. But her hands were at her neck, fingers working the knot. For a moment, Ethan didn't move, didn't blink. Then, slowly, the sack loosened. The cloth folded back. First her shoulders, then her hair, tangled and dark, matted from months of hiding. She turned slightly, and the scar came into view. It ran from just above her right temple down to her jawline, a curved, pale line like someone had tried to rip something out of her with bare hands and failed. It wasn't fresh, but it was deep, permanent, a mark that screamed louder than words. She didn't look back at him, just stood there, breathing, letting the wind touch her skin. He stepped outside, kept his distance. When he spoke, his voice was low, steady. I remember that voice. She didn't answer. 3 winters ago, Black Ridge, you pulled me out of the snow. Still nothing. Then she spoke, soft but clear. I told myself you wouldn't remember. I never forgot. A pause. Then she turned fully to face him. Her eyes met his, brown, tired, fierce. I didn't want to be seen, she said. Not by anyone. He nodded once. Still don't have to, but I see you anyway. She swallowed hard. Then the dam broke. Words came in pieces, shaky, bitter. I worked at a boarding house in Springfield, she said. Cooked, cleaned. The man who ran it said I could keep my room if I gave extra. She glanced away, jaw tightening. I said no. He didn't like that. He came at me. She paused, eyes glassy but dry. I fought back, pushed him. He slipped, hit the stove. Another beat. He died. Ethan didn't speak, just listened. They called it murder, said I lured him, said I planned it. Her fingers curled at her sides. They sold me to pay his debts, passed me around like livestock, told me I was poison, covered my face so folks wouldn't see the scar, so they'd forget I was a person. Ethan stepped closer, slow and careful. You ran, he said. I had to. You survived. No, she said, barely a whisper. I hid. She looked at the sack in her hands, then up at him. I didn't ask to be saved, didn't ask to be bought, but I'm tired of hiding. He didn't touch her, didn't say anything foolish like, you're safe now. He just said, plain as the land around them, thank you for telling me. She blinked once, twice. No tears fell, but her breath hitched. And in that breath, maybe something shifted. She wasn't a shadow anymore, not just a name whispered at an auction. She was Clara Mayfield, a woman with a scar, a story, and a voice. And Ethan Cole had turned away from none of it. The days that followed were different. Not louder, Clara still said little, and Ethan even less. But something had shifted, like the wind had changed its direction, or the cabin had taken a deeper breath. There was no longer just stillness between them. There was space. She moved through the small house with more certainty now. She swept the floor, washed the bowls, mended a tear in the blanket without being asked. And she didn't wear the sack anymore, but she didn't ask for a mirror either. Each morning she braided her hair by feel alone, eyes fixed on the corner of the window, never on her reflection in the kettle or the glass panes. The scar was there, always, but she carried it now instead of hiding under it. Ethan worked the land, fixed the chicken wire, chopped firewood. He'd come back each day and find the kettle hot, bread warming on a stone by the fire, and Clara sitting near the window, legs tucked beneath her, always watching the trees like they might whisper secrets only she could hear. Then came the visit. It was just past noon when hoofbeats cracked the silence. Ethan stepped out with his rifle in hand, but it wasn't danger that came trotting up the hill. It was a short, round-shouldered woman wrapped in a patched wool shawl, reins gripped tight, squinting under a sun hat 3 sizes too big. Agnes Harper, widow, 80 if a day, lived alone 2 ridges over, talked more than 3 preachers combined. She didn't dismount, just tipped her hat. Figured I'd check if you died out here, Ethan Cole. Thought I heard wolves last week, but maybe it was just your stomach growling. Ethan nodded once. Still alive, Miss Harper. Her eyes flicked past him to the door. Didn't expect to hear a second plate clinking. Ethan shifted, guessed. Agnes didn't miss a beat. With more effort than grace, she climbed off the horse and marched toward the porch. Clara stepped out just as the old woman reached the steps. She froze. The scar caught the light, silver against sunburnt skin. Agnes paused, looked hard, then smiled. Scars not as scary as the ones on my husband's cooking pots, and he lived through Gettysburg. Clara didn't know whether to laugh or cry. She did neither. Agnes climbed the steps, eyes never leaving her. You plan on hiding behind a bag your whole life? Or are you going to let your face get some damn sunlight? Clara flinched, but Ethan spoke up, low and firm. She don't owe anyone her face. Agnes turned to him. She doesn't, but she damn well deserves to use it if she wants. Then she looked back at Clara and softened her tone. Honey, I ain't here to judge. I've lived long enough to know shame is a liar and scars are just the body's way of saying I'm still here. Clara looked down. Agnes reached out, took her hand gently. I see you, girl, not your scar, you. And for the first time since Missouri, Clara let another woman touch her. Her fingers trembled, and she cried. No sobs, no gasps, just tears that ran quiet, like rain on warm soil. Agnes stayed for coffee, told stories about her mule, her dead husband, and the time she punched a sheriff in 52 for touching her apron without asking. When she left, she didn't say goodbye, just tipped her hat to Clara and said, Next time I visit, I better smell pie. And with that, she rode off. Clara watched her disappear down the trail, and for the first time, she smiled. Cold Creek wasn't much of a town. A saloon, a livery, a trading post, and a jail with 1 cell and no key. Folks didn't come here to make names, they came to bury 'em. It was a place where pasts got dusty and quiet, and men learned to keep their heads down unless they were reaching for a bottle or a holster. That's why people noticed right away when he rode in. Tall, lean, and still as shadow. His duster was travel-stained, a hard gray that had seen too many trails. The brim of his hat was dipped low, but not enough to hide the kind of eyes that didn't blink without purpose. Jonas Cutter wasn't just another drifter. He didn't come in loud. He came in looking. He hitched his horse at the trough, walked into the saloon without a word, didn't order a drink, didn't sit, just leaned against the counter, quiet. Then he spoke. "You got any ranchers live north of here? Solitary kind." The bartender, Tommy Graves, half deaf in one ear and twice as dumb, shrugged. "Plenty. But if you mean the one with the old mule and the crooked chimney, that'd be Ethan Cole." Cutter nodded once. "Does he have a woman with him?" Tommy blinked. "Might. Folks say he brought one back from the auction last week. Quiet girl, keeps inside mostly." Cutter's mouth twitched, just a little, not quite a smile. "Anyone ever seen her face?" Tommy laughed. "Huh, some say she's got a scar. Others say she don't got no face at all, just shadow." That made Cutter's head tilt. "What color was her hair?" Tommy scratched his stubble. "Couldn't say. She wears a sack over it." "Still, reckon so." Cutter dropped a coin on the counter. "If you see me again," he said, "don't." Then he turned and walked out. Ethan saw the dust trail from his porch long before he saw the rider. He wasn't a man to jump at shadows, but something in his spine itched. He stepped off the porch, walked to the edge of the clearing, rifle slung but loaded. The man dismounted near the old shed like he belonged there. Didn't draw, didn't shout, just tipped his hat. "Lost," he said. "Looking for timber work. Heard there's a ridge nearby." Ethan didn't move. Plenty of ridges, not much work. The man's eyes lingered on the cabin behind Ethan. "Place like this. You live alone." Ethan didn't answer, didn't need to, because the man already knew. He turned to go, but just before he mounted again, he said, too casual, "You ought to be careful what you bring home from town. Sometimes trouble's sewn into the hem." Ethan's jaw tightened. He didn't sleep much that night. Inside the cabin, Clara stirred the stew slow, her mind elsewhere. When Ethan finally stepped in, boots heavy with thought, he didn't sit, didn't eat. He just stood near the stove. "He's here," he said simply. Clara didn't look up. "Cutter?" He nodded. "He's hunting you." She didn't flinch, just reached for the old burlap sack she'd folded and placed beneath the cot. She ran her fingers along its edge. Then she whispered, "Then it's time I stop running." The moon was just a sliver above the tree line when Ethan closed the cabin door and dropped the bolt into place. The fire was down to embers. The stew sat untouched on the table. Clara hadn't eaten. Neither had he. She held the old sack in her lap, fingers brushing over the worn threads like it was a letter from a past she hadn't chosen. Her face was calm, but her eyes were far away, focused on something beyond the walls, beyond the trees, maybe beyond this life. Ethan leaned against the mantel, arms folded, eyes locked on her. "You don't have to wear it again," he said, voice low. She nodded once. "I know." Silence stretched long between them. "But I will," she added, lifting her gaze. "Not for shame, for strategy." Ethan's jaw shifted. "It's your call." Clara looked down at the sack again. "It worked once. It'll work again. He'll see what he wants to see. A woman running, hiding, scared." She paused. "But I won't be hiding this time." They laid out the plan in whispers. Cutter was smart enough not to come charging in. He'd circle first, test the air, wait for a mistake, but he couldn't resist a scent once he caught it. That much Clara knew. Men like Cutter didn't hunt for justice. They hunted for movement, weakness, blood. At dawn, she'd ride out alone, down the old fire road east, the one that cut through the shale ravine where the wind couldn't carry sound. Ethan would take the upper trail across the ridge, fast and quiet, and meet the sheriff in town. Sheriff Graham wasn't a fast talker, but he had 6 men under him and a badge that still meant something. The trap would be set where the ravine narrowed, where the pines grew so thick even eagles couldn't fly straight. "If he follows me," Clara said, tightening the twine on her pack, "he'll come straight through the choke." Ethan nodded. "I'll be waiting." She looked up. "And if he doesn't?" Ethan stepped closer, his voice like gravel soaked in rain. "Then I'll come for him." She dressed in silence. Old trail boots, borrowed trousers tied at the waist, Ethan's second-best coat. The sack she pulled tight over her head once more, knotting it with hands that no longer shook. He saddled the mare, checked the cinch, then helped her mount. The sky was barely turning gray when she turned to him. "You trust me to do this?" she asked. Ethan didn't blink. "I trust what you've survived." She nodded, then added, almost too soft to hear, "If he catches me, he won't." "But if he won't," Ethan repeated, firmer now. "He's chasing a shadow. You're the one carrying the fire." She didn't speak again, just turned the horse east and rode into the mist. Ethan stood there long after she disappeared between the trees. He didn't move until the first birds began to sing. Then he mounted his own horse, loaded 2 extra rounds into his colt, and rode the mountain pass, with one thought pulsing behind his eyes. Not this time. The sun broke late over Black Ridge, dragging long shadows across the pine-spined ravine where Clara rode alone. The path beneath her was narrow, overgrown, barely more than a game trail. Twigs snapped beneath the mare's hooves. Birds kept quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. She didn't look back. The sackcloth was drawn tight over her head again, but this time it didn't feel like a prison. It felt like armor. Each hoofbeat echoed in her chest like a war drum, but she sat tall in the saddle, shoulders square, spine straight. Not defiant, not proud, but ready. Behind her, somewhere in the hush of the forest, he followed. Jonas Cutter didn't make noise. Men like him didn't need to. They stalked like coyotes, silent, sure, sharp. But Clara knew the weight of being watched. She could feel his eyes pressing through the trees like cold fingers on her back. At the base of the ridge, the trail narrowed between 2 cliffs. The perfect choke. The air was cooler here, damp with old moss and runoff. She slowed her mare, let her steps grow heavy, deliberate, made herself look unsure, weak. It was the bait he couldn't resist, and he didn't. From the left bank, a branch cracked. Then came the voice, smooth, measured, a slow drawl soaked in poison. "Thought you could run forever, sweetheart." Clara didn't answer. She didn't have to, because that's when Ethan's voice thundered from the trees. "Drop it, Cutter!" The clearing exploded, steel against bark, boots pounding, yells cutting the silence like gunshots before the first trigger even pulled. Cutter spun, drawing fast but not fast enough. A shot rang out, not Ethan's. The sheriff's deputy, young Jeb Howard, put a bullet clean through the air above Cutter's right shoulder. Warning only. Cutter hesitated just half a heartbeat, but that was all they needed. Sheriff Graham came in from the rear, sidearm raised. 2 ranch hands from the southern hills flanked him, rifles trained. Ethan stepped out last. Calm, certain. His Colt stayed holstered, but his eyes burned hotter than any barrel. Cutter looked around, saw it all. The net drawn tight. He dropped the revolver. "Wasn't gonna shoot her," he said, smirking. "Just needed her to face justice." Ethan didn't blink. Funny, justice don't usually ride with a bounty poster, drawn in blood and rumor. Sheriff Graham stepped forward. "You're under arrest for unlawful pursuit, armed intimidation, and attempted assault. You'll be taken to Salem for a proper trial." Cutter didn't resist. Not really. His game was done. They bound his wrists, tied him to his own saddle. Clara stayed on the ridge, still and quiet beneath the sack. Only when Cutter was out of sight, hoofbeats fading into the distance, did she ride down. Ethan met her at the base of the trail. He reached up to help her off the mare. She let him. Then slowly she untied the knot beneath her chin. The sack slid off like old skin. She folded it once, twice, held it in both hands. Ethan watched her, unsure. She looked at him, her voice clear. "It saved me one last time. Not because it hid me, but because I used it." He nodded. "And now?" She looked past him, at the woods, at the trail, at the light breaking between the trees. "I'll keep it," she said, "not as a cage, but as proof." He tilted his head. "Proof of what?" She smiled. "That even the thing meant to shame me can be mine, if I choose it to be." And in that moment there was light in her eyes, not the brightness of victory, but the soft, quiet glow of someone who had made it out the other side. A week passed. The woods around Ethan's cabin turned softer with spring. Snowmelt ran down from the ridge, filling the creek with cold, clear water. The air smelled of pine sap and wet dirt. But inside the cabin the air held something else, something still, waiting. Clara moved differently now. Not quicker, just steadier. She swept the floor in slow circles. She sang under her breath when she thought no one was listening. Soft, wandering melodies that had no words. But even as Cutter's face faded down the trail, one truth remained. She was still not free, not really, because though the man was gone, the past was not. Until one morning, just after sunup, a knock came at the cabin door. Not loud, not urgent, just deliberate. Ethan opened it slow, hand resting out of habit near his hip. A woman stood on the porch, tall, brown-skinned, eyes dark and cautious. Her boots were worn near through. Her hat was clutched in both hands like a prayer. "My name's Mavis Green," she said. "I used to work the kitchen at Ridley House, Springfield." Behind Ethan, Clara stepped into the doorway and froze. Mavis did too. Her breath caught, her eyes filled. "I heard you were up this way," Mavis said softly. "Figured it was time I stopped being a coward." The wind rustled the pines. Clara didn't move, not for a long moment. Then she stepped outside. "I remember you," she said, voice flat. Mavis nodded. "You should." Clara's jaw tightened. "You were there." "I was," Mavis said, steady. "I saw him drag you into the back room. I heard you scream. I heard the crash." She looked away, ashamed. "But I didn't say a damn word." Clara crossed her arms, staring down the woman in front of her. "Why now?" Mavis lifted her eyes. "Because I should have then. Because I didn't sleep right for 3 years. Because I watched them call you a liar and I kept washing their dishes." A long silence hung. "I can't undo what I didn't do," Mavis whispered. "But I can tell the truth now, if you'll let me." Inside, at the small table near the window, they drank weak coffee and wrote out every word. Mavis recounted it all, the bruises, the threats, the silence afterward. She spoke of how the boarding house owner kept girls in line with fear, how Clara had said no, and how everything that followed wasn't justice, it was punishment. Ethan read it through with quiet eyes, then handed her the pen. Mavis signed the statement, her hand shaking just once. They sealed it in an envelope, tied it with string, and gave it to a young rider headed south toward the Salem courthouse. When he was gone, Clara stood by the door, arms wrapped around herself. "I don't know what they'll do with it," she said. Ethan stepped beside her. "But you told it," he said. "That matters." She looked at him, uncertain. "It matters to me," he added. Later that night, after Mavis had gone and the fire had burned down low, Clara held the signed letter in her hands again, just feeling the weight of it. For the first time since Missouri, the truth was no longer a secret she had to carry alone. The waiting was the hardest part. Days passed, then a week, then 2. The forest bloomed, but time inside the cabin moved slower than sap in the cold. Every morning Clara checked the trail without meaning to. Every sound of hooves in the distance turned her stomach tight. Ethan didn't say much. He wasn't the kind who filled silence. But his eyes stayed on her longer now, like he was holding the weight with her. She stopped wearing the sack completely, but she hadn't put it away either. It stayed folded on the mantel like a relic, something too old to use, too painful to forget. Then one afternoon, as the sun broke high and warm through the pines, a single rider crested the hill. Brown coat, red courier sash, dust in his beard. He pulled a sealed envelope from his satchel and handed it to Ethan without a word. Ethan thanked him, nodded once, then watched the rider turn and disappear down the trail. Clara stepped out onto the porch. Her hands were already shaking. Ethan looked at her. "It's from Salem." He didn't open it. He handed it to her. She stood there a moment, frozen, then broke the wax. The paper inside was thin, creased neat, the ink clean. She read it once, then again, then a third time, lips moving with each word. Finally, she spoke. Charges dropped. Case closed. Warrant rescinded. She whispered it like she didn't believe it. Ethan stepped closer. She handed him the letter, her fingers lingering a second longer than they needed to. He read it. Slow. Careful. Then folded it, placed it back in the envelope, and handed it to her again. "It's yours," he said. Clara didn't reply. She turned and walked past the firewood pile, past the split-rail fence down to the tree line where the forest grew thick and soft with moss. She moved with no rush, no fear, just a quiet sort of purpose. At the base of the same pine she once sat beneath in hiding, she knelt. The moss was cold under her palms. She placed the letter beside her, ran her fingers through the roots, like she was searching for something older than truth. Then she closed her eyes and whispered, barely more than breath, "For the first time in my life, I don't have to run." No tears came, just silence. But it was the kind of silence that felt like peace. Justice hadn't come with applause. No trumpets, no sheriff in shining boots. Just a letter, a signature, and the quiet strength of someone who had lived to see the truth. Rise. The days after the letter felt like breathing different air. The same wind moved through the trees. The same kettle sang each morning, but something had changed. Not outside, but in Clara. Like a thread had come untangled inside her chest, and now her shoulders sat a little higher. She no longer glanced over her shoulder. She no longer hesitated before opening the door. One morning, as Ethan was out checking the east fence line, Clara found something new on the table. Not flowers, not food, a mirror. Small, round, silver-framed, worn at the edges but clean, polished to a soft shine. It leaned against a wedge of pine, placed at just the right angle to catch the early sun through the window. Beside it lay a folded scarf, sea-green silk, faded a little but still soft as breath. No note, no words, just there, waiting. She stared at the mirror for a long while, unmoving. Her hands stayed at her sides. Then she stepped closer, sat down, and looked, not quick, not startled, just steady. The scar was still there. It always would be. She traced it with her fingertip, not flinching. Her skin remembered. So did her bones. But for the first time she didn't look away. This was her face. This was her story, and she wasn't ashamed of either. Her fingers moved to the scarf. She lifted it gently, felt the fibers slip between her fingers like water from a cold creek. She brought it to her head and tied it back, not to hide anything, but to shape what others would see. Not fear, not guilt, just a woman who chose. A soft knock on the frame of the open door pulled her eyes to the side. Ethan stood there, shoulder resting against the post. He didn't say anything right away, just nodded toward the scarf. "That used to be my wife's," he said. "She wore it when she needed to feel like herself again." Clara touched the edge near her temple. "I thought maybe it'd suit you too," Ethan added. She turned in her seat, facing him fully. No flinching, no defense. He looked straight at her, scar and all, and didn't look away. "Anyone who tries to make you ashamed of what you lived through," he said, voice like old oak, steady and strong, "is blind." A pause, then softer. "And the blind don't get to judge beauty." Her throat tightened. The tears came, not hard, not sharp, but warm. Cleansing. Quiet. She looked back into the mirror one last time, then reached out and placed her palm against the glass, met her reflection halfway. For the first time since the fire in Springfield, Clara Mayfield let herself be seen. Spring had taken hold of the hills. The wildflowers bloomed without asking permission. Lupines, yarrow, bluebells pushing up through the thawed ground like small rebellions. The forest, once still and watchful, now felt like it was breathing easy again. And up on the rise behind Ethan's cabin, something new was being built. Not a barn, not a fence, a wedding arch. Simple. 4 upright beams, a crosspiece carved by hand, draped linen that swayed in the morning breeze like it had been waiting all winter for this moment. Ethan built it slow, like every nail held more than wood. Like each swing of the hammer settled something deeper. When it was done, he stood back, hands on hips, boots in soft earth. Then he nodded once, satisfied. The guests were few. That was how they wanted it. Agnes Harper arrived first, riding her mule, dressed in blue gingham with a crooked bonnet and carrying a peach pie that leaned dangerously to one side. Mavis Green came next, wearing her best Sunday coat and a smile that stretched wider than the valley. The blacksmith from town brought a bottle of apple brandy, and the shopkeeper's wife brought bread still warm from her oven, wrapped in a cloth embroidered with small lavender sprigs. They weren't many, but they were enough. Inside the cabin, Clara stood before the mirror, the same one Ethan had given her. Her dress was cream muslin, hand-stitched over weeks of quiet nights. The seams weren't perfect, but they were hers. The scarf she wore wasn't green this time. It was white, made from the same sack she once wore to hide her face. Ethan had washed it, sun-dried it, cut and hemmed it with careful hands. The edges were stitched with tiny purple flowers, just like the ones on the old handkerchief she'd left behind in the snow years ago. She didn't wear it to cover her scar. She wore it because she chose to, because she had turned something that once symbolized silence into something sacred, a veil. When she stepped out of the cabin, the clearing fell still. Ethan stood beneath the arch, freshly shaved, hair combed, boots polished. He wore his best shirt, creased and clean, the only one without sap stains. But he didn't see the shirt. He saw her. The woman who once crouched in the corner with her hands on her knees and fear in her bones, now walked to him with her head high, her steps slow and full of choice. When she reached him, he took her hands. They were calloused, warm, real. He didn't read vows from a book. Neither did she. Instead, he looked her in the eye and said, "Steady. No matter what covered your face, you were always the woman I chose." A breath. "And now, you're the woman I vow to stand beside to the end." Clara smiled. Not the smile of someone who had survived, but the smile of someone who had healed. She whispered, "And I vow the same." No priest, no choir, just wind and trees and people who mattered. When they kissed, soft and sure, a breeze stirred through the linen overhead. A few drops of rain fell, light as breath. Agnes leaned toward the blacksmith and said with a huff, "Never thought I'd see a burlap sack turned into a wedding veil." The blacksmith chuckled. "Ain't the sack," he said. "It's what she turned it into." The sky turned gold that evening, stretched soft over the ridge like someone had pulled a wool blanket over the world. A quiet settled over the clearing, not silence, but something better. Peace. The kind that hums low in the bones, earned, not given. They didn't have a band or a dance floor, just a porch, a table, and laughter thick as honey. Clara sat on the steps, veil folded in her lap, tracing the embroidered edge with her fingers. She wasn't hiding it, wasn't holding it like something fragile, just feeling it, acknowledging it, like a scar you could finally name without shame. Ethan leaned against the porch post, sipping brandy from a tin cup, his free hand resting on Clara's shoulder without thinking. Mavis poured coffee for Agnes, who loudly complained it needed more sugar, then promptly drank 2 cups anyway. The blacksmith was telling a story no one could follow, but everyone enjoyed, and the shopkeeper's wife passed around thick slices of peach pie, each one messier than the last. At one point, Agnes leaned close to Clara, her voice warm and dry, like cedar smoke. "Girl," she said, "you know what you did today?" Clara tilted her head. "You made that cabin of his look like it's finally got someone living in it." Clara smiled, small but real. "Wasn't just the cabin," she replied. "It was me, too." Agnes nodded. Damn right it was. They toasted with whatever they had. Coffee, whiskey, brandy, tea. No speeches, just quiet grins and the soft sounds of cutlery on plates and boots, rocking back on heels. Later, after the guests had gone and the fire inside was just a low orange sigh, Clara and Ethan sat side by side on the porch. The veil rested between them. She picked it up, looked at it for a long moment. Then she said, "Funny. This thing used to mean everything I feared." Ethan looked over. "And now," Clara smiled, not wide but full. "Now it means everything I chose." He nodded, slow, reached over, laced his fingers through hers. They sat like that until the stars came out, quiet, rooted, steady, and the forest, once a place she ran through, now wrapped itself around them like home. The morning after the wedding broke clean and blue, with sunlight dripping through the pines like honey on fresh bread. A breeze moved through the clearing, slow and curious, lifting curtains and leaves, carrying the scent of pine, earth, and something sweeter, peace. Clara stood out near the edge of the pasture, watching a pair of deer cross the stream below. The grass brushed against her skirt, and the sack veil, now clean, folded, hung over her shoulder like a shawl. She wasn't wearing it, just carrying it, like a story she no longer ran from. Behind her, Ethan was fixing the fence line with an old hammer and quiet hands. He didn't speak much in the mornings, and she liked that about him, how the silence between them never felt empty. After a while, he walked over, sweat on his brow and a smile just beneath his beard. "You know," he said, voice low like gravel in warm water, "you don't have to carry that thing around anymore." Clara looked down at the veil in her hands. "I know," she said, "but I want to." She looked at him, eyes steady. "It's not a prison anymore. It's proof. I walked through the worst of me and came out the other side." Ethan reached out and took her hand, not because she needed help standing, but because he could. Because that's what love does when it's quiet and honest. It just shows up. They sat down on the porch again, same place as last night. Birds called from the ridge. Somewhere down the trail, Cold Creek bustled back into its usual rhythm, bargains, boots, and broken fences. But up here, time moved slower. "Kinder," Clara set the veil beside her and said softly, "This place, it gave me space to breathe again." Ethan watched her face, not her scar. "It didn't give you nothing," he said gently. "You took it. That's braver." She smiled. "You always say the right thing," he grunted. "Nah, I just say what's true." They sat like that, listening to wind in the trees and the creak of the old rocking chair. The mountains stood tall in the distance, just as they had long before Ethan and Clara ever crossed paths, and just as they would long after, But here now, in this small clearing with its patched fence and hand-built home, two people had found something rare, not perfection, not erasure, but healing. And for folks like them, weathered, wounded, still standing, that was enough. And so, under the whispering pines of Cold Creek, two broken souls found something they never expected: peace. Not perfection, not forgetfulness, but the kind of quiet that lets old wounds breathe. Sometimes love doesn't ride in with thunder. Sometimes it walks slow with a limp and a scar, and just sits beside you when the fire's burning low. If this story touched you, even just a little, drop a comment below. A simple one will do. Let us know you're out there riding the same dusty trails of feeling and memory. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, true to the land, to the people, and to the heart, consider subscribing. We've got a place at the campfire waiting just for you. Until then, may your coffee stay hot, your horses stay loyal, and your heart stay kind.